This is so hard, but I think I've realized that I can't even say the word. Why can't I say the word? I mean, why can't I just say, I mean, what is wrong? Why do I have to be so ashamed? I mean, why can't I just say the truth? I mean, be who I am. I'm 35 years old. I'm so afraid to tell people. I mean, Susan, I'm gay.
That was Ellen DeGeneres. Now, you're more used to seeing Ellen DeGeneres probably as a talk show host, but in 1994, when that clip happened, she was a comedian with a show called These Friends of Mine. It was sort of like the precursor to Friends. And in this episode, the clip that I showed you, she is coming out as gay. She, both the actress and the character, came out as gay, and it was a huge deal in 1994. I remember everyone talking about it, all the talk shows. People were asking everyone, are you going to tune in to watch the show? But then once that episode happened and season 5 started in 1995, something kind of unfortunate happened. And it was that almost every episode from then on had to do with Ellen being gay. There was the episode where Ellen went on her first lesbian date. There was a clip where a friend tried to hook Ellen up on a lesbian date. There was the episode where Ellen had to debate whether or not she should support a particular business because it was lesbian owned. Everything was about Ellen being a lesbian, all the jokes, all the episodes. And fairly predictably, it got old pretty fast. And the show, which I always thought was a good show, got canceled in 1995 because all people could see once Ellen DeGeneres and her character came out as gay is a gay character, and everything became seen through that lens. That's what it means to have a trait that is marked, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The writer and the biologist Julia Serrano, herself a trans woman, explains that a marked trait is something about a person that, quote, other people actively notice and pay attention to. That's in contrast with the many, many traits about people that we often just ignore or don't recognize. So in her book, Excluded, Serrano illustrates the point this way. She says, imagine that someone walks past you wearing jeans, a t-shirt, whatever attire you would normally expect of a person. Well, obviously, you're not really going to pay much attention to that person's dress unless they were wearing something that you thought was interesting. And if you stopped to talk to them, you probably wouldn't make any real assumptions about them because they just look normal. Now, imagine that someone walks by you in some religious headdress, like a burqa or a turban or a Jewish sudra. Now, you're probably going to notice because most people, depending on where you live or aren't going to walk past you wearing such things. And if you walk up to them or they walk up to you and start talking, you might make some assumptions about them or see them in a way that you wouldn't have seen a person in jeans and a normal t-shirt. That's kind of what it means to be marked. It's to have a trait about you that speaks so strongly to people that that's primarily what they can hear. This brings us to an important point about what marks a trait. Traits are marked relatively, and that means that what traits do and don't command our attention is partly a function of the environment around you, the person who sees it, and the person who has the particular trait. So a foreign accent, for instance, might be a marked trait if you encounter it in the space where it's far from the norm, but it won't be a marked trait in spaces where that accent is common, maybe like a neighborhood where folks from that nationality congregate. Another function of what makes a trait marked, and maybe how marked it is the general social significance of that trait. So how shocking or noteworthy is the trait and its expression in your culture? In Ellen DeGeneres' case, her lesbianism was a highly marked trait in 1994, where it isn't so today because the culture has changed. The numbers of out lesbians has certainly changed too, but it's probably fair to say that lesbianism is still a minority sexual preference. But what's really changed is that homosexuality just isn't a big cultural deal like it used to be. Norms have changed in general. They've relaxed so that what used to be a strong cultural norm around heterosexuality that saw homosexuality as shocking and deviant, our culture has come to view lesbian a little bit more differently and tolerantly. To say that a trait is marked is not necessarily to say it's marked in a bad way. People can pay excessive attention to traits they interpret in positive ways as much as they can traits they interpret negatively. When a student is seen as very gifted, for instance, people could focus so strongly on that a possibly wonderful trait in a sense that colors their expectations and thoughts about that student. Or we can imagine a female who's blonde and considered quite beautiful by people. And if you talk to females like that, you usually find out they experience some frustration because people sort of expect them not to be very bright, not to be very knowledgeable about stuff. One final example, just to illustrate the point of how actual marked traits actually show up in the world. So if you are over a certain body size, what people would consider fat or obese, and you go to a doctor and you complain about feeling a certain sort of way, you feel tired or you feel tense or you feel sick. Studies have shown that you are more likely to be misdiagnosed. And the reason is that doctors will often see your size and sort of assume, because the trait speaks so loudly to them, I guess, that that's probably what is the cause of the worry. And that doesn't mean the doctor is just a bad doctor or trying to misdiagnose a problem. It means that doctors are doing what they would normally do. They're trying to get as much information in the situation as they can. And the problem is that this one trait kind of speaks loudly to them. And they might say, I know one possible reason why people of a certain size are going to feel sick or tired or tense. And that's because of body weight. So let's go with that. And what that does is it often prevents them from going further into like family history or medical history. And the studies in question actually test what happens when people that doctors would say are a more normal size go in and complain of the same things. Doctors are more likely in those cases to treat medical history seriously, to treat family history seriously, to treat what the patient says about him or herself seriously. And that is just one instance of the way a marked trait can speak so loudly that it shuts out a lot of other considerations. Towards this end, sociologist Irving Goffman did a study in the 1960s on what he calls stigma, those traits that in Serrano's terms are marked, but in Goffman's case, in a solely negative way. Most of the stigma traits that Goffman focuses on are physical ones. Physical deformities, extreme stutters in speech, conspicuous physical features. Goffman defines stigma in this way. While the stigmatized stranger is present before us, evidence can arise of his possessing an attribute that makes him different from others in the category of persons available for him to be, and of a less desirable kind. In the extreme, a person who is quite thoroughly bad or dangerous or weak. He is then reduced in our minds from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. Such an attribute is a stigma, especially when its discrediting effect is very extensive. Sometimes it is also called a failing, a shortcoming, a handicap. It constitutes a special discrepancy between virtual and actual social identity. Goffman is interested in exploring how people with stigmatized traits cope with their stigma. Some hide from the judging world more than they would, as when the person with severe disfigurement only leaves the house when they believe others aren't likely to be around. Others do their best to camouflage the stigma, as when a stutterer does her best not to speak in public, or the person with a skin discoloration only leaves the house after treating it with heavy makeup. As we've said, there's no reason why a trait being marked and coming in for focused attention need be a bad thing. But stigmatization is generally a bad thing. It produces psychological effects in the stigmatized person. It also risks treating traits that shouldn't indicate inferiority or even important difference as indicating exactly those things. Most troubling of all, and maybe this is the most relevant for future teachers, marking and stigmatizing traits means that we often see the trait rather than the person who has it. Or we allow a trait to limit our understanding of the person in ways we might not be limited if we put less importance on that trait. As I like to say it, and the Ellen example illustrates, marking a trait often means making the trait speak so loudly that the person's voice and actions get drowned out. In 1952, Ralph Ellison wrote a novel about this very thing, a book I consider to be one of the greatest novels ever written, called Invisible Man. It's about a black man whose name we never come to know, a deliberate point on Ellison's part, who goes through the world being treated by others as anything but a unique individual. In college, for instance, he feels the pressure of being to everyone else a hope to represent his race and others' expectations for it. At his job, he's seen as a black worker who, because of those two features, surely must want to join the local workers' union. To a political organization he joins, he finds himself once again being the face of the race. At the beginning of the novel, the unnamed protagonist frames his situation this way. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. And I hope I'm not giving any spoilers by saying the conditions don't improve except in a really strange ending to the book. This is also the situation I think Ellen DeGeneres was up against in 1994. When she was just Ellen, her show was free to create a wide range of new episodes, and Ellen was never expected to allow one trait to define or limit what she could do. When she became lesbian Ellen, lesbianism being a pretty marked trait at the time, this limited what everyone, apparently including her sitcom writers, thought she could or should do. I don't think it's much exaggeration to say that the markedness of her lesbianism is a large part of what did her sitcom in. There's a big variety in marked traits. Some of them are easily visible, like your certain skin color or an accent that you have or another conspicuous physical feature. Or it could be something invisible unless a person chooses to let others know about it, like one's religious belief or one's sexual orientation or some other fact about one's life. Even in those latter cases, though, it can be a burden because one constantly feels like they have to keep a certain trait in the closet because if they let it out, that's the only thing other people might see about them. To wrap up, I hate to be pessimistic, but I doubt that we'll ever get to a point where we stop marking traits. As long as there are social norms, we're likely going to see as conspicuous some of those traits which deviate from norms. Nor, as we've said, is marking traits per se a bad thing. But we can at least strive to fight against some of the minimizing and stigmatizing effects of marking traits. For instance, we can try to be at least somewhat aware that certain traits someone has speak really loudly to us and that we risk missing other things about that person. And when we identify that we might be doing that, we can try to figure out other things about the person that might distract us from that trait. We could be honest about ourselves about what traits might speak really loudly to us, and we can take care when we find them to tone their volume down a bit. We can also try to allow others to surprise and confound our expectations. Where something about the person leads us to expect this, we can acknowledge when we get that instead. And when we see traits that are being marked by others or stigmatized in a way we think is wrong, we can speak up and do things that might counteract some of those tendencies.